What happens when the highest court in the land officially confirms what you've been thinking all along? That's exactly what occurred yesterday when the Supreme Judge delivered a brutal ruling against Keir Starmer, citing his catastrophic prioritization failure. If you felt gaslit by mainstream media telling you everything's fine while your cost of living skyrockets, this ruling validates everything you've been saying. The judge specifically mentioned Starmer's obsession with Ukraine and Gaza, while British citizens struggle with inflation, immigration chaos, and rising crime. Stay with me as I reveal the full details the news isn't covering. 99% of you watch without subscribing. If you enjoy the content, hit the subscribe button. It's free and helps us a lot. Ever wondered why your family is struggling while Starmer jets around on the international stage? The Supreme Judge certainly has, and what he's discovered about our Prime Minister's priorities is nothing short of shocking. While Starmer is busy schmoozing with Donald Trump and lecturing the world on international affairs, British families are being left behind. And now, there's a ruling that proves it. Let's look at what happened during Starmer's recent trip to the White House. There he was, standing next to Trump, putting on his serious face and declaring, "We have to do everything we can to ensure that the ceasefire continues so that more hostages can be returned, so that aid can be brought in that's so desperately needed." The situation in Gaza matters, but while he's solving world problems, British families face their own crisis at home. The economic projections that came out this week are absolutely devastating. British families, yes, that probably means your family, could be £1,000 worse off under Starmer's current economic policies. 1,000 quid. That's not pocket change, is it? That's food on the table, heating in winter, clothes for the kids. While your bank account takes this hit, Starmer's playing diplomat on the international stage. This exact issue got the Supreme Judge so riled up that he literally accused Starmer of having abandoned his primary responsibility to the British people. That's directly from the judge's mouth. When a Supreme Judge uses language like that about a sitting Prime Minister, you know things are serious. As we reveal Starmer's priority list, the numbers paint a story no one can ignore. At the top, Ukraine and Gaza, foreign affairs that get him in the papers. At the bottom, the British economy, crime on our streets, and the immigration crisis. Starmer is like a firefighter rushing to distant blazes, while his own station burns to the ground. Meanwhile, as Starmer expresses his deep concern about humanitarian aid in Gaza, British families face their own humanitarian crisis. Energy bills through the roof, food costs that make you wince at the checkout, inflation eating away at savings. The judge specifically mentioned how Starmer seems more concerned with international optics than with ordinary Brits struggling to make ends meet. The economic data the Supreme Judge reviewed paints a grim picture. Inflation continues to rise, pushing essential goods further out of reach for many families. The cost of living crisis is getting worse. And Starmer's response? More international summits, more photo ops with world leaders, more statements about crises thousands of miles away. What really got the judge fired up was that Starmer's focus on international matters over domestic problems represents what the ruling described as a catastrophic prioritization failure. The judge ruled that this failure constitutes a breach of Starmer's oath of office. Let that sink in. A breach of his oath of office, the very promise he made when he became Prime Minister to serve the British people. The judge is essentially saying that Starmer has fundamentally failed in his most basic duty, looking after the people who elected him. The ruling specifically points out the disconnect between Starmer's international focus and domestic needs. It's now a matter of legal record that our Prime Minister has put his global image ahead of his responsibility to the British people. The legal record gets even more damning when we examine Starmer's Ukraine strategy. The Supreme Judge's scathing assessment that Starmer has been playing international hero while his own country burns is backed by concrete evidence presented during the proceedings. Let's look at what's actually happening here. While British families can barely afford to heat their homes, our Prime Minister has been jetting around playing diplomat on the Ukraine crisis. The court records show an exhaustive catalogue of high-level meetings, international phone calls, and diplomatic summits where Ukraine dominated the agenda. Meanwhile, critical domestic policy meetings about Britain's own problems were repeatedly postponed or delegated to junior ministers. What's particularly galling is how Starmer has positioned himself as the crucial bridge between America and Europe on Ukraine policy. He spent countless hours in video calls and face-to-face meetings with foreign leaders, carefully crafting his image as an international statesman. The judge noted with particular disdain how Starmer boasted about this role during a press conference in Brussels, even as reports emerged of record food bank usage back home. This strategy worked, at least temporarily. Following his diplomatic efforts regarding Ukraine, Starmer's favorability rating rose to a 6-month high of 31%, according to YouGov. The judge specifically highlighted this polling data as evidence of Starmer's true motivations. While families like the Johnsons in Manchester were choosing between heating and eating, their Prime Minister was busy chasing approval ratings through international photo ops. The most revealing testimony came from within Starmer's own party. Several Labour MPs privately testified about their frustration with the Prime Minister's priorities. These MPs described how they've been instructed to emphasize international talking points over constituent concerns, a direct contradiction to what voters were promised. One MP reportedly told the judge that party officials had explicitly warned them against dwelling too much on domestic problems that might undermine Starmer's carefully crafted international image. International virtue signaling cannot replace domestic government, declared the Supreme Judge in one of the ruling's most quotable lines. While his global image shines, a darker reality unfolds at home. Starmer turned down 3 separate meetings about Britain's economic crisis during the same period he was holding daily Ukraine briefings. The evidence reveals a Prime Minister with priorities as unbalanced as a scale, with international optics on one side and buried domestic concerns on the other. The internal Labour Party conflicts revealed during the proceedings were particularly damaging. MPs testified about heated, behind-closed-doors arguments over policy priorities, with several senior party figures pleading with Starmer to refocus on domestic issues, particularly immigration and asylum policies. These concerns were systematically dismissed, with one MP testifying that they were told, "International diplomacy builds the credibility we need to govern effectively at home." The judge called this reasoning backward and self-serving. After reviewing all the evidence, the judge determined that Starmer's hypocrisy represents a fundamental breach of trust with the British people that cannot be repaired. The finality of that statement speaks volumes. This ruling is a moral indictment. It confirms what many have suspected, that Starmer's government operates on a principle of do as I say, not as I do. While the government pretends everything is fine, British families struggle with rising bills. Ask yourself, who is Starmer really serving?